The human eye can process approximately 10 to 12 individual images per second before they blur into continuous motion. What Bruce Lee did to Olympic bronze medalist Gary Elms on a humid August afternoon in 1967 happened in less time than it takes to consciously register 3 such images. By the time Elms' nervous system transmitted the sensory data to his brain, the confrontation had already ended, his worldview had shattered, and Bruce Lee had returned to his original position, with his arms folded as if he'd never moved at all. This is the story of what happens when skepticism meets inevitability, when Western boxing's measured brutality collides with something the sport had no vocabulary to describe, and how 10 seconds of compressed violence became a philosophical earthquake that would ripple through martial arts gyms across 3 continents for the next half-century. I was 23 years old that day, working as an assistant instructor at Bruce Lee's Chinatown Kwoon in Los Angeles, tasked with managing the steady stream of challengers, doubters, and curiosity seekers who appeared at our door with increasing frequency. The room smelled of tiger balm, old sweat, and the particular mustiness of canvas-heavy bags that had absorbed decades of impact. Late afternoon sunlight cut through the second-story windows in geometric shards, illuminating dust particles that hung suspended in the air like golden static. Bruce was demonstrating Chi Sao sticky hands with James Lee, their forearms connected in a continuous flow of pressure and response. When Gary Elms walked through the door, Elms stood 6'1", maybe 190 pounds of layered muscle earned through Olympic training camps and professional fight preparation. His face carried the particular confidence of men who've survived violence at the highest levels, a calm that comes from knowing exactly how much damage your fists can deliver and how much punishment your body can absorb. He wore a tailored gray suit, incongruous in our austere training space, and carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. Behind him came 2 men I would later learn were his manager and a sports journalist from Ring magazine, both carrying notebooks and the skeptical expressions of people who'd seen too many martial arts charlatans to be impressed by reputation. Alone. Bruce stopped mid-motion, his forearm still connected to James's, and turned his head toward the door with that particular stillness he possessed, the kind that made you aware of how much unnecessary movement most people carry in their bodies. He was 5'7", 135 pounds, wearing black cotton pants and a white undershirt darkened with sweat at the collar and armpits. Next to Elms, he looked almost delicate, a sparrow regarding an eagle. But I'd spent 9 months watching Bruce move, studying the mechanical precision of his techniques. And I'd learned that visual size measurements meant nothing when dealing with someone who'd rebuilt martial arts from first principles, stripping away tradition to expose the brutal mathematics of leverage, timing, and neurological reaction speed. "I'm looking for Bruce Lee," Elms said, his accent carrying traces of London's East End beneath professional polish. "Got some questions about what I've been seeing in the magazines." Bruce detached from James and approached with that gliding walk, his center of gravity so stable he seemed to float rather than step. "I'm Bruce Lee. What questions?" Elms smiled, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of a craftsman encountering an enthusiastic amateur. "I've been seeing these articles, these photos of you doing your thing. Very impressive. Very dramatic." He paused, letting the implications settle. "My manager showed me some footage from your demonstrations. That speed you show, the 1-inch punch, the finger jabs moving faster than cameras can track impressive cinema. But I've trained with Sugar Ray Robinson. I've sparred with Muhammad Ali. I know what real speed looks like in the ring, and I know what camera tricks look like in the movies." The temperature in the room didn't change. The dust still hung in the sunlight. The heavy bags still swayed slightly from their chains. But something shifted in the atmosphere, some subtle redistribution of tension that made my shoulders tighten involuntarily. Bruce's face remained neutral, pleasant even, but I noticed his breathing had changed, dropping into that slow, deep rhythm he used before explosive movement. "You think my speed is special effects," Bruce said. "Not a question. A statement requiring confirmation." "I think," Helms replied carefully, "that real fighting speed happens in the ring, under pressure, with consequences. What I see in demonstrations looks very fast because there's no resistance, no real threat. Put that same speed against someone who knows how to move, how to defend, and it becomes normal. Human, beatable." He shrugged, his massive shoulders rolling beneath expensive fabric. "No disrespect. You're obviously skilled. But Olympic boxing and professional fighting, that's real combat. The speeds you're claiming, they're not human." I watched Bruce's hands, still hanging loose at his sides, and noticed his fingers had begun that subtle microflexing, opening and closing by perhaps a quarter inch, almost invisible, unless you knew to look. James Lee had moved to the wall, his arms crossed, his face carefully blank. Don Inosanto, who'd been working the wooden dummy in the corner, had stopped mid-strike, his hand still pressed against the worn wood. The journalist was writing furiously in his notebook. Elm's manager watched Bruce with the clinical assessment of a man evaluating livestock. "What would convince you?" Bruce asked, his voice still conversational, almost friendly. Elms considered this. "Simple test. You stand there. I stand here. We're what, about 8 feet apart?" He glanced at the floor, calculating. "You try to hit me anywhere. Doesn't matter before I can block or move. I've got professional reflexes, trained defense. If your speed is real, if it's actually faster than Olympic-level reaction time, you should have no problem. If it's camera tricks ... double quotes," he smiled again. "Well, then we'll know." "And when I hit you?" Bruce asked. "Not if, when." "If you hit me," Elms corrected gently, "before I can react, I'll know you're legitimate. I'll tell everyone I know. But Mr. Lee, I've been hit by the fastest punchers in professional boxing. My nervous system is trained to process threats and respond in fractions of a second. What you're describing speed that can't be blocked or evaded, that defies human physiology." Bruce nodded slowly, as if this was perfectly reasonable. "You're saying my reputation is built on illusions. That real fighters like yourself operate at speeds I only pretend to possess." "I'm saying," Elms replied, his voice taking on a harder edge, "that there's a difference between demonstration speed and combat speed, and I think you might have confused one for the other." I thought about interrupting. I thought about the liability, about what might happen if this went wrong, about insurance and lawsuits, and the delicate politics of Bruce's growing reputation. But I'd also seen what happened when Bruce was pushed, when skepticism activated. Something primal in him, some need to prove that his reconstructed martial art wasn't theory but physics, not philosophy, but brutal mechanical fact. And I'd learned that watching Bruce Lee respond to doubt was like watching a chemical reaction inevitable, escalating, irreversible. "Okay," Bruce said simply. "Stand there. Don't blink." Elms positioned himself in a boxer's stance, hands up, knees slightly bent, weight distributed on the balls of his feet. Professional positioning, textbook perfect. The accumulated wisdom of 100 years of ring combat compressed into optimal defensive geometry. His eyes locked onto Bruce with the focused attention of a man who'd been trained to track jabs coming. At his face at 15 miles per hour. The journalist stopped writing. James Lee's jaw tightened. Inosanto shifted his weight, his hand dropping from the dummy. Bruce stood 8 feet away, arms hanging loose at his sides, his posture so relaxed. It bordered on casual. He looked like someone waiting for a bus, not like someone preparing to attack an Olympic boxer. But I could see his breathing, could track the subtle shifts in his muscle tension, and I knew he was doing calculations, measuring distance, evaluating angles, mapping the neurological pathway from Elm's eyes to his defensive muscles, accounting for the 150 to 200 milliseconds it takes the human brain to process a visual stimulus and transmit motor commands. "You understand," Bruce said quietly, "that once I move, you won't be able to stop what happens. Your nervous system isn't fast enough. Not because you're not skilled, you obviously are, but because the human body has limits. Reaction time has a ceiling. I've spent 10 years learning to operate underneath that ceiling." Elm's face remained confident, but something flickered in his eyes, some ancient survival instinct recognizing predatory stillness. "Show me." What happened next would be argued about, analyzed, and recreated in martial arts schools for the next 50 years. The journalist's account would appear in Ring magazine with the headline, "The Impossible Punch." Don Inosanto would describe it in seminars as the moment he understood that Bruce Lee had transcended technique and entered pure physics. James Lee would say simply, "Gary never had a chance." His brain was still processing the first movement when the third one had already landed. Bruce moved. Not moved. That word implies a beginning, a middle, and end discrete phases that can be tracked and comprehended. What Bruce did was appear in a different position, as if reality had stuttered, as if he'd existed in two places simultaneously, and the universe had simply corrected the error. His rear foot barely seemed to push, his body barely seemed to rotate, but suddenly his right fist was pressed against Gary Elm's face, his knuckles resting gently on the bridge of Elm's nose, directly between his eyes. The boxer's hands, which had been raised in perfect defensive position, were still raised in perfect defensive position, utterly unchanged, as if they'd been painted onto the air. Bruce's fist remained there for perhaps half a second, long enough for Elm's brain to register its presence, for his eyes to cross slightly, trying to focus on the knuckles pressed against his nose, for the full horror of what had just failed to happen to sink into his consciousness. Then Bruce stepped back, his body returning to that loose, casual stance, his breathing unchanged, his expression neutral. The entire exchange had lasted less than 3 seconds from movement to reset. Gary Elm's face did something I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. His professional composure, that calm confidence earned through years of violent competition, simply crumbled, replaced by naked confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching existential terror. His hands, still raised in their defensive position, began to tremble. Not shake, tremble. A fine vibration that started in his fingers and worked its way up his forearms. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His eyes went distant, unfocused, as if he was trying to access a memory that his brain insisted couldn't exist. What? He started, then stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I didn't see you move. I was watching. My hands were up. I was ready." His voice carried the confusion of a man whose reality had just been edited without his permission. "I didn't see anything until your fist was already there. No wind-up, no telegraph, nothing." Bruce's expression hadn't changed. "Your nervous system experienced approximately 200 milliseconds of lag time between when your eyes registered movement and when your brain could command your muscles to respond. I moved through that gap. Your hands didn't block because by the time your brain sent the signal to block, the strike had already arrived and I'd already withdrawn. You weren't slow, Gary. You were human, and human reaction time has a ceiling." The journalist was staring at his notebook, his pen hovering above the page, as if trying to figure out how to document something that defied documentation. Elm's manager had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. James Lee remained against the wall, his arms still crossed. But I caught the slight nod he gave me, the acknowledgement that we'd just witnessed something neither of us would fully comprehend. Until years later. But I was watching Elm's face, watching the progression of emotions as his identity as an elite athlete, someone who'd medaled at the Olympics, who'd sparred with legends, who'd earned the right to confidence through violence. Validation collided with irrefutable physical evidence that everything he understood about combat speed was incomplete. Not wrong, exactly. Just operating in a different universe than whatever Bruce Lee had demonstrated. "Do it again," Elm said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Please, I need to see it again." Bruce studied him for a moment, and I saw something shift. In his expression, a recognition perhaps that this wasn't about ego anymore, wasn't about defending reputation or proving skeptics wrong. This was about a fellow martial artist encountering a boundary he hadn't known existed and needing to understand its dimensions. "Okay," Bruce said, "but this time, I want you to do something. Don't try to block. Just watch. Process what your eyes are showing you without trying to react. Your training is interfering with your perception. You see the beginning of my movement, and your brain immediately jumps to defensive programming, which creates a processing delay. Just watch. Just see. They reset to their positions, 8 feet apart." But this time, Elms dropped his hands slightly, his stance relaxing into observation mode rather than combat mode. His eyes locked onto Bruce with different intention, not a fighter preparing to defend, but a student preparing to learn. Bruce moved again. This time I caught more detail, though catching might be the wrong word. I saw his weight shift, barely perceptible, his rear hip rotating perhaps 30 degrees, his shoulder dropping, his fist traveling forward in a straight line that seemed to violate the physics of required wind-up, of necessary telegraphing, of momentum that has to build from larger muscles before expressing through smaller ones. His arm simply appeared extended, as if the intervening space between retracted and extended had been deleted from reality. Not his fist stopped an inch from Elm's nose. Held there. Bruce's breathing remained calm, his body showing no signs of effort. No tremor in the extended arm that suggested strain or maximum exertion. He'd moved from 0 to full extension and stopped with surgical precision, controlling both the acceleration and deceleration with equal mastery. 3 components, Bruce said, his fist still hovering an inch from Elm's face. Economic motion, no wasted movement, no unnecessary rotation. Straight line from point A to point B, explosive contraction, fast twitch muscle fibers fired in precise sequence. Distal to proximal, whip cracking through the kinetic chain. Non-telegraphic. Positioning, no chamber, no wind-up, no warning. The technique starts from where your hands naturally hang, which means there's no preparatory movement to tip off the nervous system. He withdrew his fist, returned to relaxed stance. "You weren't beaten by superior speed, Gary. You were beaten by superior efficiency. I didn't move faster than you can move. I moved faster than you can perceive and react." Elm stood very still. The trembling in his hands had stopped, replaced by something else, a focused intensity I recognized from my own training. That moment when the brain stops defending its existing models and opens to radical new information. His face had changed too. The condescension was gone, burned away by direct experience. What remained was humility, curiosity, and something approaching wonder. "I've been boxing since I was 12 years old," Elm said quietly. 15 years. Olympic training camps, professional fights, sparring with world champions. I thought I understood combat speed. I thought I'd seen the ceiling of what human reflexes could achieve. He looked at his hands, still raised slightly, as if they'd betrayed him. "But you just showed me that everything I learned was incomplete. Those Olympic-level reflexes I'm so proud of, you moved through them like they didn't exist." Bruce stepped closer, his voice dropping into that teaching tone he used when philosophy was about to merge with physics. Your boxing skills aren't inadequate, Gary. They're optimized for a specific combat model, the ring. The rules, the expected rhythm of attack and defense that generations of fighters have refined. Within that model, you're elite. But Wing Chun, Jeet Kune Do, what I'm developing operates in the gaps between that model. Where boxing creates strong defensive frames, I attack the transition points between frames. Where boxing establishes range and rhythm, I eliminate range and interrupt rhythm. It's not better or worse. It's addressing a different problem. Elm's manager had found his voice. Mr. Lee, I've managed fighters for 20 years. I've seen every style, every gimmick, every supposed secret technique. What you just did, that's not a technique. That's not something that can be trained. That's neurological. That's... He trailed off, searching for language. Inevitable, Bruce finished for him. It's inevitable because it's built on anatomical reality rather than stylistic tradition. The human nervous system operates at fixed speeds. Visual processing takes 150 to 200 milliseconds. Motor command transmission takes another 50 to 80 milliseconds. Those aren't variables. They're constants. Once you understand the constants, you can design attacks that arrive faster than the defensive response can be deployed. He looked back at Elms. You didn't fail, Gary. Your nervous system performed exactly as biology demands. The problem is that biology has limitations, and I've spent a decade learning to exploit them. The journalist had finally started writing. Again, his pen moving frantically across the page, trying to capture something that resisted capture. Mr. Lee, are you saying that any trained fighter could learn to move this fast? That this is replicable? Bruce considered this carefully. Any trained fighter can learn the principles. Economic motion can be taught. Non-telegraphic positioning can be practiced. But applying those principles at combat speed requires rewiring 10,000 hours of existing movement patterns. Most martial artists spend their lives learning to move in specific ways, chambering their punches, loading their kicks, telegraphing their intentions through preparatory movements that make their techniques powerful but predictable. Unlearning that, rebuilding from zero, accepting that everything you've mastered might be suboptimal, that's the real challenge, not the speed. The letting go. Gary Elms walked to the heavy bag hanging in the corner, pressed his palm against the worn canvas, and stood there for a long moment, his forehead resting against his hand. I could see his shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths, could sense the recalibration happening inside his skull. When he turned back, his face had settled into a different configuration, the arrogance gone, replaced by something more durable. I came here to expose a fraud, he said simply. I was convinced your reputation was built on camera tricks and gullible audiences. I thought 10 minutes of honest testing would reveal the truth. He laughed, but without humor. I was right. 10 minutes did reveal the truth. Just not the truth I expected. Bruce nodded slowly. You're not the first. Last month, a karate black belt stood where you're standing and accused me of the same thing. Before that, a kung fu sifu from San Francisco. Before that, a judo instructor from San Diego. They all came with certainty and left with questions. That's the gap I'm trying to close between what traditional martial arts claims is possible and what physics actually allows. Show me something else, Helms said suddenly. Please. I need to understand the full scope of what I don't know. And this is where the afternoon transformed from confrontation into education, where Gary Elms, Olympic bronze medalist, professional boxer, man who'd built his identity on being elite, made the choice that separates true martial artists from mere fighters. He chose humility over ego. He chose learning over face-saving. He chose to let his worldview shatter so something more accurate could be built from the fragments. Bruce spent the next 90 minutes systematically dismantling every assumption Elms held about combat. He demonstrated the 1-inch punch generating knockout power from a distance too short to build momentum according to conventional boxing wisdom. He showed trapping controlling both of Elms' hands with one of his own while striking with the other, creating offensive opportunities that boxing's two-handed defense couldn't address. He explained Chi Sao sticky hands drills that developed tactile sensitivity, allowing you to feel your opponent's intention through pressure and respond faster than visual processing allowed. But more than techniques, Bruce showed principles. He placed Elms' fist against his chest and told him to punch with full power. Then, using only footwork and angle adjustment, he let the punch slide past his body without blocking, demonstrating how positioning makes force irrelevant. He explained the concept of stop hitting attacking to the opponent's attack, occupying the center line while they're still preparing their strike, turning their own momentum against them. He talked about economy of motion, like an engineer discussing efficiency ratios, about neural pathways, like a neurologist discussing reaction cascades, about combat philosophy, like a physicist discussing applied mathematics. I watched Gary Elms face throughout this education, tracking the progression from confusion to comprehension, from resistance to acceptance. His professional fighter's ego, the protective shell that elite athletes build to survive violent professions, was being systematically stripped away, revealing something more vulnerable but more valuable underneath: genuine curiosity about truth. At one point, Bruce placed a cushion on Elms' chest and asked him to stand against the wall. 1-inch punch, Bruce explained. Watch my fist. It starts here, pressed against the cushion, and transfers force through this much space. An inch, maybe less. Your boxing tells you this isn't enough distance to generate power. But power doesn't come from distance. It comes from speed of force delivery. Watch. Bruce's fist twitched forward, perhaps an inch, barely visible movement. And Gary Elms slammed into the wall behind him as if he'd been hit with a battering ram. The cushion compressed, then exploded outward. Elms' entire body, all 190 pounds of Olympic-trained muscle, lifted off the ground and impacted the plaster with enough force to leave a slight depression. His eyes went wide, the breath driven from his lungs in a surprised gasp. He slid down the wall and caught himself, his legs slightly unsteady, his hand moving to his chest as if checking for broken ribs. Jesus Christ, he whispered. That was. How is that possible from 1 inch? Bruce rubbed his knuckles absently. Hip rotation, shoulder drop, forearm snap, and fist penetration all triggered within 0.1 seconds. The force doesn't build gradually. It detonates on contact. Your body doesn't have time to brace because the impact arrives faster than your nervous system can coordinate a resistance response. He helped Elms away from the wall. Boxing builds power through distance: the 6-inch jab, the 12-inch cross, the 8-inch hook. Each technique optimized for ring ranges. But in close quarters, where grappling and clinching eliminate boxing range, that distance-based power becomes inaccessible. The 1-inch punch addresses that problem. It's not magic. It's applied physics. Dan Inosanto had joined us now, standing beside James Lee, both of them watching this impromptu seminar with the attention of anthropologists witnessing a cultural exchange. The journalist had filled half his notebook, his hand cramping from continuous writing. Elms' manager stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his face cycling through expressions: skepticism, confusion, reluctant acceptance. Everything I've learned, Elms said, his voice carrying an edge of something between grief and excitement. All those years of training, the technique refinement, the conditioning, the sparring, it's not wrong exactly. But it's incomplete. It's optimized for one type of combat, and there are whole other types I never considered. Bruce nodded. Boxing is a complete system within its context: the ring, the rules, the gloves, the weight classes. It's been refined over generations to produce optimal outcomes within those constraints. But remove the constraints, add grappling, add weapons, add multiple opponents, add environmental variables, and the optimization becomes limitation. That's not boxing's failure. That's the danger of any tradition that stops questioning its assumptions. This moment, this recognition that mastery in one domain doesn't guarantee competence in adjacent domains was the real transformation. Not the speed demonstration, not the power display, not the technical superiority. The philosophical realization that expertise can become a prison if it makes you believe you've learned everything worth learning. Gary Ohm sat down on the floor, his back against the wall where he'd impacted moments before, and put his head in his hands. Not in defeat, exactly. In overwhelm. In the specific exhaustion that comes from having your cognitive models forcibly upgraded, from having to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. I am an elite athlete who medaled at the Olympics, and I just encountered someone operating at a level I didn't know existed. The thing is, Helm said, his voice muffled by his hands, I genuinely believed my reflexes were fast enough to handle anything human speed could deliver. I'd trained with the best. I'd survived Olympic competition. I thought that meant I understood the limits of possibility. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. But you just showed me that I was living inside a much smaller box than I realized, and now I can't unsee that. I can't go back to believing what I believed an hour ago. Bruce sat down beside him, folding into a cross-legged position with that effortless flexibility, his breathing still calm, still deep, showing no signs of exertion despite the 90 minutes of demonstration. That's the most dangerous thing I can do to a martial artist. Not beat them physically, that's temporary, that heals, but show them that their entire framework is limited, that years of training might have been building toward a ceiling that's lower than they thought. That's permanent. That changes how you see everything. So what do I do now? Elns asked. I can't go back to boxing thinking I've mastered combat. I can't step into the ring with the same confidence. You've broken something in me, and I don't know how to fix. You don't fix it, Bruce said quietly. You build something new from the pieces. You take what's valuable from your boxing, and there's tremendous value there. Gary, your footwork is excellent. Your conditioning is world-class. Your ring IQ is sharp, and you add to it. You study what you've seen today. You question every assumption. You become a beginner again, but a beginner who's already elite at the fundamentals. That's rare. That's valuable. They sat there for a moment, two martial artists from completely different traditions, sharing the silence that follows revelation. The afternoon light had shifted, the golden shafts moving across the floor as the sun descended toward the loss. Angelus skyline visible through the windows. The sounds of the city drifted up: car horns, distant sirens, the ambient hum of a metropolis that had no idea. This small room had just hosted a transformation. The journalist approached cautiously, his notebook clutched like a shield. Mr. Elms, for my article, how would you describe what you experienced today? Gary Elms stood slowly, testing his legs, his hand still pressed against his chest where the 1-inch punch had landed. He looked at Bruce, then at the journalist, then back at Bruce. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone trying to articulate something that resisted articulation. I came here believing that elite boxing training had shown me the ceiling of human combat speed. I was wrong. What I experienced today wasn't just faster technique or better training. It was a fundamentally different understanding of how human bodies can move, how nervous systems can be exploited, how physics applies to violence. Bruce Lee didn't beat me today. He educated me. He showed me that the universe of martial arts knowledge is vastly larger than what my tradition had mapped. And now I have a choice. I can reject what I've seen to protect my ego, or I can accept it and rebuild my understanding from a more accurate foundation. Which will you choose? The journalist asked. Elms smiled, and for the first time since. Walking through the door, it was a smile without armor, without performance. I'm a fighter. Fighters adapt, or they lose. I've just been shown a massive gap in my adaptation. So I'll do what any real martial artist would do. I'll close that gap. I'll learn. I'll train. I'll rebuild my skills with this new information integrated. He extended his hand toward Bruce. If you'll teach me. Bruce took his hand, held it for a moment, his expression unreadable. You already learned the hardest lesson today, Gary. Most people can't learn that one, even if you spend years teaching them. You learned that mastery isn't a destination. It's a direction. You keep moving in that direction until you die, and you never arrive. But the moving itself, that's the art. They shook hands, that specific handshake between warriors that carries more weight than contracts or promises. And I watched something complete itself. Some circuit that had started with skepticism and ended with mutual respect. Gary Elms would train with Bruce Lee for the next 18 months, appearing at the Coon twice a week, always in that gray suit, always with his notebook, documenting everything, questioning everything, rebuilding his combat framework from the ground up. He would later tell interviewers that those 18 months taught him more about martial arts than his previous 15 years combined. He would incorporate trapping, non-telegraphic striking, and centerline theory into his boxing, creating a hybrid approach that confused opponents who expected conventional boxing patterns. His professional career would extend another 8 years, and he would credit his longevity to the adaptability he learned that August afternoon when his worldview shattered against Bruce Lee's fist. The journalist's article would appear in Ring magazine 3 weeks later under the headline, The Impossible Punch, when Olympic boxing meets something boxing has no name for. It would include detailed descriptions of the speed demonstration, technical breakdowns of Bruce's methodology, and Gary Elms' testimony about experiencing combat speed that defied human reaction time. The article would be controversial traditional martial artists claiming exaggeration, boxers insisting it was impossible, physicists writing letters arguing about neural transmission speeds and the mechanical limits of human muscle contraction. But everyone who was in that room, everyone who witnessed those 10 seconds when Gary Elms, Olympic medalist, professional fighter, elite athlete, stood helpless as Bruce Lee's fist materialized against his face faster than his nervous system could process. Everyone who saw the transformation from skepticism to humility to dedication, we knew the truth. We'd seen the moment when someone encountered a boundary they hadn't known existed and chose to cross it rather than deny it. I think about that afternoon often now, decades later, when martial arts is fragmented into 1,000 specialized styles. When YouTube makes every technique accessible, but context remains elusive. When people argue online about whose style would win without understanding that the question itself reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. Gary Elms walked into our Coon, believing he'd found the ceiling of martial arts performance through Olympic boxing. He walked out understanding that the ceiling he'd found was just one room in a mansion with infinite rooms, and that true mastery isn't about dominating your room, it's about recognizing there are always more rooms to explore. The thing about encountering someone like Bruce Lee, someone operating at a level that seems to violate the rules of what you thought was possible, is that it forces a choice. You can reject the evidence to protect your worldview, or you can shatter your worldview to accommodate the evidence. Most people choose protection. Gary Elms chose shattering. And in the broken pieces of his certainty, he found something more valuable than confidence. He found humility, real humility, not false modesty. The humility that comes from direct experience of how much you don't know. How vast the landscape of possibility extends beyond your current position. That's the lesson that afternoon, really. Taught not about speed or technique, or the superiority of one martial art over another. The lesson was about the choice every martial artist faces when confronted with something that contradicts everything they've learned. Do you defend your training, or do you defend the truth? Do you protect your investment in existing knowledge, or do you pay the cost of starting over with better information? Gary Elms walked in with certainty and walked out with questions. But questions, it turns out, are more valuable than certainty. Certainty makes you stop searching. Questions keep you moving. And the movement, that endless journey toward understanding, that willingness to have your worldview destroyed and rebuilt as many times as necessary to get closer to truth. That's the real martial art Bruce Lee was teaching. The speed was just the method of instruction. The philosophy was the actual curriculum, not 10 seconds of confrontation, 18 months of transformation, a lifetime of understanding that mastery isn't something you achieve. It's something you pursue until the day you die, always aware that the horizon keeps receding, that every answer reveals 3 new questions, that the mountain you're climbing grows taller the higher you ascend. Gary Elms learned that lesson faster than most. Bruce Lee's fist, pressed against his nose, delivered it in less time than it takes to blink. And the truth, once delivered, can never be unlearned. You can only choose what to build with it.